He woke up and opened his eyes and found his unexpected reward a sweet alien. Slave Victor stretched as he blinked into wakefulness, his spine arching with a quiet groan as the morning hum of the dome settled into his ears. The air inside the habitat was cool, dense with the scent of moss-filtered humidity and the faint sterilized bitterness of nutrient gel. Pale green light filtered through the canopy overhead, bending through the dust-streaked dome panels and splashing shifting patterns onto the floor. It should have been just another morning systems check root growth survey. Silence, but someone was there. The breath caught in his throat mid-yawn. There, curled at the foot of his bed like some forgotten offering, lay a woman. Victor sat up fast, the synthetic blanket slipping from his chest as his heartbeat surged. She wasn't human. Her skin was a smooth, soft shade of sky blue, like moonlight refracted through water. Not uniform traces of violet shimmered beneath the surface like veins of color. Beneath frost, her hair was striking long braided gold that cascaded over her shoulder and pulled like sunlight. Beside her she wore only a ceremonial wrap of pale silk, barely sufficient for the dome's temperature. No shoes, no bag. Nothing but the collar around her neck and the documents sealed just beneath it. She didn't stir, but she wasn't sleeping. Victor had seen enough field biology to recognize tension her whole body held. Still, not with rest but practice, discipline, not limp but locked, as if waiting for permission to breathe for a moment. He just watched her, the way her fingers curled tightly inward against her chest, the way her lashes fluttered. Once, then stilled every motion or lack of it. Deliberate, he swung his legs over the side of the bed, bare feet against the cool composite floor, and approached her slowly. Kneeling beside her, he reached for the parchment tucked at her throat. It was sealed with wax and a sigil he recognized. Zarati Council. His lips pressed into a tight line as he unfolded the page. To honor your successful rebalancing of the eastern biomes, the Council of Zarati bestows upon you one of our remaining and bonded. She has been conditioned in silence, obedience, and care. May your seed complete the harmony you began. His stomach turned. He read it again, slower, though every word was already etched behind his eyes. Not a greeting, not a request, a ceremonial proclamation. They had gifted her like pollen in a vial, like a mineral sample, like a favor owed and paid. He looked at her again. Her head remained bowed, but he saw it now. Each breath she took seemed measured, as if waiting for approval. Her hands trembled slightly, even in stillness. Victor backed away, stood, turned sharply, and crossed to the food alav. He moved on instinct, not habit. He didn't want to touch her, didn't want to confront what they expected of him, so he did something else, something sane. He heated a bowl of nutrient root porridge, stirred it slowly as steam rose from the thick pale mixture. He didn't look at her when he brought it back, just crouched and placed it within reach. You're cold, he said quietly. Eat, please. No answer, not even a blink. I didn't ask for this, he added, his voice lower now, and I don't want anything you haven't chosen to give. He stood, taking 2 steps back. His palms remained open, fingers spread like a surrender. Still nothing, but after a long pause she shifted slightly. Her hands moved slow, hesitant, and wrapped around the bowl. She brought it to her lips with practiced caution. Then she took her first bite. Victor saw it all, the small tremor in her hands, the speed with which she swallowed as though expecting it to be taken away. She coughed once, tried to mask it, failed. He stepped forward without thinking, careful, too fast. She flinched, not a subtle cease. Her whole body jerked back, arms raised to shield her face. The bowl clattered to the ground, porridge splashing across the mat. Victor froze mid-step. He didn't touch her. I'm not going to hurt you. Her arm stayed up for another breath, too, then slowly lowered. He exhaled. This wasn't obedience, it was trauma etched in a muscle memory. He dropped to one knee and gently wiped the spilled food off the mat, saying nothing more, letting her watch, letting her decide. When he finally rose, she was watching him, her eyes lavender gray and softly glowing, held no judgment, just waiting. What had they done to her? Victor turned toward the desk and sat down, pulling open a data log to pretend to focus. The numbers meant nothing. He only needed space. Silence. She didn't speak, she didn't eat again, but eventually she lay back down, still curled but less tightly than before. Her head rested on her forearm, her breathing evened. It took over an hour before her shoulders stopped twitching at every movement he made, and just before he powered down the dome's main lights for the night cycle, he heard it, a whisper of a word, not Zarati, not human either, a name. He turned, but she was already asleep. Her body had relaxed in the smallest way, legs no longer drawn so tightly, arms no longer clenched. For the first time she seemed not braced for harm. Victor watched her under the dome's bioluminescent canopy. The vines above them pulsed faintly with life-sensing breath, warmth, presence. This was no tradition, no honor, just a deeply dressed cruelty hidden in the ritual of diplomacy. He sat back in a chair, hands Folded against his lips, breath caught in a knot he couldn't name. Who was she? Why was this still allowed? Why had they chosen him? Victor didn't sleep that night, not really, but sometime near morning he made his first decision. He wouldn't use her, wouldn't touch her unless she chose it, and if Zarate wanted her back they'd have to take her from him. The dome was already awake by the time Victor stepped into the main chamber. Pale morning light streamed through the dew-streaked canopy, turning the green filtered glow into a quiet forest shimmer. The air inside was thick with moisture still clinging to the coolness of night and laced with the faint scent of sterilized moss and fresh growth media. Victor moved without speaking. He hadn't slept much, maybe an hour, maybe none at all. His body was awake but his mind hadn't settled. Something about having her in the same space asleep on that woven mat had tangled up thoughts he didn't even know were still alive in him. He stood at the far planter bed, sleeves rolled up, hands sunk elbow deep in the loam. The work was unnecessary. He pruned these root systems less than 40 hours ago, but he needed something to ground him, something that didn't flinch when touched, something that wouldn't look at him and wait for a command he'd never give. Behind him, silence, not the peaceful kind, the kind where breath is held, the kind that comes before judgment or after trauma. He turned his head slightly, just enough to see her out of the corner of his eye. She was still lying on the mat, exactly where she had been the night before, but now she was facing the room, not the wall. Her eyes were open, watching him. Her body hadn't moved yet. He could tell she was fully awake. The blanket he'd left over her was still in place, though she'd drawn it closer around her shoulders, wrapping it in a tight knot near her collarbone. Her golden hair, once neatly braided in ceremonial formality, was now loose, a disheveled curtain half hiding her face. Victor looked away, not out of guilt but to give her space, let her choose when to exist in this room. He returned to the planter, brushing away a layer of overgrowth, carefully slicing through a tangle of phototropic tendrils that had wrapped around a nutrient stem. The movement was meditative, clean, no questions, just responses, but still he felt her eyes on him, curious, hesitant, afraid. He didn't blame her. Victor had been on Zarate for 3 years by choice technically, but the kind of choice one makes after burning bridges, after Trio Station, after the inquiry, after being cleared and still marked. No one forgets the name of the men who almost accelerated a gene collapse on a colonial food world. He hadn't done it, but he hadn't stopped it in time either. That's what made this planet perfect. No team, no press, just roots, fungi, vines, and silence. Until now he heard movement behind him, not loud, not sudden, bare feet brushing softly against the composite floor. The sound made something in his chest shift. He kept his hands in the dirt a moment longer, unsure whether to speak. Then he stood slowly and turned. She was upright now, still wrapped in the blanket, arms crossed under the fabric like a barrier. She didn't speak, but her eyes, those strange lavender gray eyes flecked with soft gold, watched him without blinking. He didn't step closer. Instead, he gestured gently toward the table. I want more porridge if you're hungry. She hesitated, her gaze flicked to the table, then back to him. For a long moment she didn't move. Then she walked soft, slow steps to the chair across from where he usually ate. She didn't sit right away. Her hands hovered above the surface, uncertain. Then she pulled out the chair, lowered herself carefully, and folded her legs beneath her in a neat practice motion. Victor moved with equal care. He placed the bowl in front of her, no fanfare, no gesture of ownership or invitation, just offering. She picked up the spoon slowly, as if expecting it to be taken from her. She stirred once, twice, then lifted a small portion to her lips, swallowed, waited. He watched her, not for control but to make sure she didn't choke again. She didn't. After 2 more bites she spoke one word, Sarah. Victor blinked. Is that your name? She nodded, but it was so faint he almost missed it. They call me other names, she added softly, but I chose that one. Victor sat back in his chair, his heartbeat catching on something he hadn't expected. Chose. That word carried weight. He didn't ask what the other names had been, didn't want to hear what she'd been called by people who saw her as a gift. Sarah, he said slowly, thank you for telling me. She kept eating slower now, with something approaching rhythm. He watched the way she held her hands close to her body, always the way her spine remained perfectly upright even when she relaxed her shoulders, not ease training. Small marks lined her forearms, symmetrical, faintly raised, not scars from injury but from ritual. He'd seen similar designs in council records, traced into the flesh of and bonded during submission rites. They were shaped obedience, physical memory. His hands curled slightly into fist beneath the table. After a few minutes, she placed the spoon down and sat quietly. I'll be working outside today, Victor said, more to fill the space than ask anything of her. Southern quadrant. The vines out there are sensitive. They react when people walk too close, curl up like they're shy. Her lips twitched slightly. He couldn't tell if it was the start of a smile or just the idea of shy vines catching her off guard. "You're welcome to come," he added, "but you don't have to. It's just safer than staying in here alone if you want to move around." She didn't answer, but when he stood and reached for his field bag, she rose too. Not a word, not a request, just a choice. It was more than he expected, more than anyone had probably allowed her in a long time. And as they stepped out into the filtered light of Zaret's jungle morning, Victor glanced sideways once, just once, and saw it, her gaze tracking the path ahead, watching, not waiting, not yet free but not afraid to follow. Zaret's southern quadrant pulsed with quiet, humid life. The air outside the dome was thick with the scent of moist bark, rich soil, and sweet spores drifting lazily through shafts of filtered sunlight. Broad-leafed vines draped over the path like hanging veils, their edges curling subtly toward movement, reactive, cautious, almost shy. Victor stepped carefully through the undergrowth, a long-handled sensor pack slung over one shoulder, his boots brushing against bioluminescent moss that pulsed faintly beneath each step. He'd walked this path dozens of times before, but today felt different, slower, sharper, because she was walking behind him, not beside him, yet not close enough to suggest comfort, but not far either. Her pace matches almost precisely each step measured. She didn't speak, didn't fidget, but he could feel her presence. Like gravity, steady, fragile, and constant. Sarah, he tried the name again in his mind. It fit her far better than anything the council might have carved into her. A soft, flowing name chosen. She hadn't asked where they were going, hadn't even questioned the gear in his hands, but every time he glanced back he caught her watching, not in fear this time, but curiosity, quiet observation, the kind of look someone gives a strange animal that might be dangerous but also might not be. Victor crouched beside one of the outer beacon vines, brushing aside a curtain of leaf veins. "This one's growing too fast," he murmured to himself, not really expecting her to answer. Still, she stepped forward slowly, her fingers trailed just above the plant, not touching, hovering. The vine pulsed faintly beneath her hand, curling back on itself like a drawn breath. "They react to attention," he said, softer now, light movement, emotion. "If the stem currents are strong enough." She tilted her head, studying the curl of the leaf, the way it folded like a closing hand. "It's afraid." Victor looked at her. You can tell she didn't meet his gaze, but nodded. Once he turned back to the vine. "Most researchers don't think they process fear, only reaction and reinforcement, but I'm not sure there's a pattern in the sap flow. Changes subtle like hesitation." Sarah didn't say anything, but she knelt beside him, mirroring his position. Her fingers didn't tremble this time. She didn't reach out, but she was close enough that he could feel the warmth of her body beside him. Victor swallowed and returned to his work. He connected a stabilizer to the vine's base, careful not to pierce the root too deeply. A faint vibration traveled up through his fingers as he adjusted the contact plate. It was like the plant shivered. Wei glanced at her again. She was watching him, not the vine, him, not studying, not flinching, just present. He cleared his throat. "You don't have to stay out here if it's too humid. I can set the perimeter shield to guide you back." She shook her head once, then after a pause, "It's quiet here." Victor nodded. "That's why I came." She looked at him, then really looked. "Were you sent here as punishment?" The question struck harder than he expected. "No," he said after a moment, "not officially." Sarah lowered her gaze again, but her expression didn't close off. Victor wiped his hands on a cloth and sat back on his heels, letting his breath ease out. "I was part of a research team on a station orbiting Trios Prime," he said, voice low and level. "We were testing accelerated crop cycles for frontier colonies. I was in charge of verifying genome integrity. I missed a protein drift, nothing catastrophic but enough to cause panic. I wasn't fired, but trust evaporates fast and laps, especially when food is involved." Sarah listened without speaking. Her hands rested calmly on her lap, but her posture remained perfectly still. It was the stillness that told him she understood, the kind that isn't. "Indifference is waiting to see if you'll break while speaking," he continued. "After the hearings I requested reassignment somewhere far, somewhere green, somewhere no one asks you to explain your presence at the table. You're still explaining," she said softly. He glanced at her. There was no sarcasm in her voice, just truth. Victor gave a faint, tired smile. "Old habits." They worked in silence for a while after that, him logging plant growth rates and recalibrating beacon signals, her simply observing. At one point she reached toward a leaf that had drifted too close, and when her fingertips brushed its edge, the plant shuddered and bloomed, unfurling into a soft spiral of glowing white filaments. Sarah inhaled sharply, not in fear, in awe. Victor straightened. "That one's rare," he said. "They only bloom when they detect resonance from unfamiliar organic patterns." She looked At him eyes wide, so it likes me. I think it sees you. The words left his mouth before he could stop them. Something changed in her expression, not quite a smile, not quite a frown, just a softening, a crease at the corner of her mouth. A breath caught. They started walking back toward the dome as the sun shifted in the sky, filtered through the dense canopy. The warmth thickened, heavy and fragrant with plant oils and pollen bursts halfway down the path. Sarah slowed. Victor turned. You all right? She didn't answer immediately. Then she said, you offered me food, a name, space. Victor waited. Sarah took a breath, her voice quieter than before. But you never asked me if I wanted to stay. Victor froze. He hadn't. He realized it all at once, not out of cruelty, but because somewhere deep down he had assumed the decision had already been made for her, that offering kindness in a cage still meant it was a cage. I'm sorry, he said sincerely. Sarah's shoulders relaxed, not fully but noticeably. Then she said, I don't want to leave. He nodded once, throat tight. Then you won't. And together they walked the rest of the way home. The sun had dipped low behind the tree line, casting long golden shadows across the research dome. Inside, the air buzzed softly with a quiet hum of equipment running in idle mode. Bioluminescent plants along the perimeter began to glow, their gentle light painting the walls and pulses of soft green and blue. Sarah sat near the edge of the room, legs folded beneath her, hair draped over one shoulder like liquid gold. She wasn't curled in on herself anymore, not withdrawn. She wasn't speaking yet either, but something had changed. There was weight to her presence now, a growing substance in the way she held herself. Victor noticed it too. He'd felt it during the walk back, not just her choice to follow, but the deliberate stillness that had replaced her earlier defensiveness. She was choosing this not because she had to, not because she was told to, but because it was hers to choose. He knelt by one of the nutrient beds and checked the fungal bloom readings. The numbers were steady. The environment was thriving, but it wasn't the plants holding his attention tonight. He glanced back at her. Do you ever miss it? She asked suddenly, her voice quiet as it was, carried clearly in the dome silence. Victor blinked. Miss what? She hesitated, then clarified, where you were before the station, the other humans. He sat down slowly, wiping his hands on a cloth. I thought I would. At first I did. But the longer I was away, the more I realized what I really missed wasn't people, it was purpose. Trust the feeling that what I did mattered to someone. Sarah nodded, but her expression shifted. Something in her eyes dimmed slightly. He tilted his head. You. She looked down at her hands, fingers loosely laced together. I don't know what it's like to miss something freely. We weren't allowed to want. Missing something meant you remembered it. Remembering meant it had meaning. We were taught to forget. Her words weren't bitter, they were facts recited from a place deeper than anger. Victor leaned forward. You don't have to answer this if it's too much, but what was your life like before? She paused. Then slowly she lifted her gaze. I was born in a cradle house, one of the breeding centers on the central continent. My mother was part of the artisan caste, but she fell out of favor. No father I know of. They separated infants early, categorized by genetic markers, aesthetic viability, docility. Those who met bonding criteria were assigned to the unbonded program. Victor listened without interrupting. They taught us language, posture, protocol, but we weren't allowed to speak unless instructed. We were graded on compliance. Touch without expression was rewarded. Eye contact was corrected. Wanting was discouraged. A breath escaped her lips. Quiet, steady, but full of everything she hadn't said. I wasn't a person, I was a symbol, a gift meant to say something about someone else. Victor's jaw tightened. He wanted to say something. Anything, but words felt too shallow, too hollow in the face of what she'd lived. I tried once, she added, barely above a whisper, to run. I was maybe 12 cycles old. I didn't even make it past the outer corridors. They didn't punish me physically, they removed my name. It was erased from the record. I was instructed to respond only to commands, no identity. Just function. Victor swallowed, the knot rising in his throat, and then she continued. They told me I had been chosen not for bonding, not for partnership, as a gift, a reward, and that I was lucky. You weren't, Victor said, his voice quiet but firm, and they were wrong. Sarah looked at him for a long time. Something subtle shifted behind her expression, like a breath she hadn't allowed herself to take, finally made it to her lungs. What about you? She asked. You told me about the station, but before that, before the scandal, who were you? Victor leaned back, resting his forearms on his knees. The question cut deeper than he expected. I was a prodigy, he said after a moment. Top of my class, published young, the kind of kid professors write recommendations for before they know your name. I believed in systems. Any idea that life, biology, ecosystems, even human behavior could be mapped, predicted, controlled? He smiled without humor. And then I watched an entire agricultural module collapse because I overlooked a Variable. I didn't lose my job, but I lost every ounce of certainty I'd built my identity on. Suddenly I wasn't the brilliant young scientist, I was the guy who made everyone nervous at meetings. Is that why you came here? He nodded. Zarate was open, remote, quiet, and the idea of starting over without anyone expecting anything of me, it felt like survival. Sarah was silent for a moment, then she said, "You came here to be invisible." Victor looked at her. "And they sent me here to disappear," she added. Their eyes met. It wasn't just understanding, it wasn't pity, it was recognition, a mirrored ache in different shapes. "I don't want to be invisible anymore," she said. "You aren't," Victor answered. "Not to me." The silence that followed wasn't heavy this time, it wrapped around them like warmth, like safety. Sarah stood crossing the room in slow, measured steps. She sat beside him, not too close, not demanding, but with intention. "I don't know who I'm supposed to be," she said quietly. Victor didn't respond right away. Then he offered, "You don't have to be anyone except who you choose, and you can take your time." She looked at him, then down at her hands. After a moment she whispered, "I think I want to remember who I was before they taught me to forget." Victor nodded. "Then we'll start there." The knock came at midday, just as the heat outside pressed against the dome like a living thing. Victor was calibrating the water flow regulators beneath the hydroponic panel, his sleeves rolled up, forearms strewn with soil and nutrient film. He barely heard the chime, soft, deliberate, too formal to be a warning, too composed to be casual. He wiped his hands clean on a cloth, rose slowly, and moved to the airlock panel. Through the tinted glass, two figures waited, one tall, clad in a silver diplomatic vest with the crest of the Zarate Council woven into its front panel, the other shorter, leaner, standing a half step behind, the kind of posture reserved for security, not a routine visit. Victor keyed the door open. "Dr. Mayor," the envoy greeted, voice smooth and measured. "I hope this isn't an inconvenience. I'm Leuven of the council delegation, here to conduct a routine wellness check regarding our prior cultural exchange." Victor didn't move. "You mean Sarah?" A faint smile tugged at the corners of Leuven's mouth. "If that's the designation she prefers." "She's not a designation, of course. May we come in?" Victor stepped aside, saying nothing. The pair entered slowly. Leuven's eyes moved across the dome's interior like a scanner, taking in the tidy supply crates, the control consoles, the sleeping area, and then settling on Sarah. She stood near the rear wall, spine straight, arms folded carefully in front of her. Her hair had been tied back into a loose braid she'd done herself that morning. One of her new routines, she said. It helped her feel like she had a shape, a choice. Today it shimmered under the dome light like a thread of captured sunlight. Leuven offered a polite nod. "You're looking well and bonded." Victor took a step forward. "She has a name." "I'm sure she does," Leuven said, tone cordial. "However, until her classification is updated through the official channels, her status remains council-bound." Sarah didn't speak, but her fingers tightened ever so slightly at her sides. "What do you want?" Victor asked, his voice lower. "Now, as I said, we're conducting a check-in. Certain and bonded from the last cycle have remained unclaimed. There's been some confusion about your intent. The council assumed full integration had occurred, but the records shown no confirmation of acceptance, no legal declaration, no bonding mark, not even a transfer of name." Victor felt his chest tighten. "You're here to take her back if she remains in used." Luther then replied, his tone still maddeningly calm. "She must be reassigned." Victor stepped in front of Sarah before he even realized what he was doing. "She's not an asset. You misunderstand. The program was designed." "I know what it was designed for," Victor snapped. "Diplomatic offerings, cultural leverage, a civilized way to call it ownership." Leuven raised an eyebrow. "Then perhaps you also understand that in the absence of formal declaration, her return is mandatory." Silence stretched. Victor turned slightly, catching Sarah's eyes. There was fear there, but something else too, not the frozen stillness she'd carried when she first arrived. This was different, a question in her gaze. "What do I do?" She had asked for the right to choose, and now she was waiting to see if he'd let her. He swallowed, then turned to Leuven. "I've integrated her into my station," he said, voice steady. "She performs tasks, maintains order, provides insight into local flora that your sensors can't replicate, that meets every requirement your guidelines mandate." Len paused. "You're asserting utility." "I'm asserting presence," Victor replied, still without declaration. "She's not an embodied, she is Sarah. She gave me her name and I accepted it." Lynn glanced at Sarah. "Did you?" She nodded. "Once it was small, but it was enough." The envoy hesitated, the other figure silent until now, shifted ever so slightly, a subtle tension, readiness to act. Victor saw it, and then Sarah did something she hadn't done before. She stepped forward. Her voice, when it came, was quiet but clear. "If you take me," she said, "you won't erase what I've learned. I Will still remember who I became. Even if you remove my name again I will find it. The weight of her words settled into the room like a stone dropped into still water. Lennon studied her for a long moment, then with the same unshakable civility he gave a short bow. Very well. We'll file this interaction as a confirmed voluntary pairing. A formal record will follow for final signature. Victor didn't move until the airlock seal behind them. Only then did he let the breath out of his chest. Sarah remained still, eyes fixed on the door. Long after they were gone. You didn't have to say anything, Victor murmured. I would have stopped them. She turned to him. I know, but I needed to say it. Victor walked over and sat beside her on the storage bench. They didn't speak for a while. Eventually she broke the silence. I was afraid you'd hesitate. I did, he admitted. She nodded slowly. But you didn't stop. I won't. She leaned her shoulder into his, not heavily, just enough to feel that he was there, solid. Real. I don't want to belong to someone, she whispered. I want to belong with someone. Victor didn't answer. He just reached over and took her hand carefully, gently. This time she didn't flinch. The sky outside the dome had deepened into violet. The first true night since the council's visit. Warm dusk light filtered through the overhead canopy, flickering across the floor in shades of lavender and gold. The jungle beyond was alive with soft rhythmic calls from unseen creatures, their distant voices echoing like memories through the trees. Inside it was quiet. Victor stood at the edge of the hydroponic beds, hands resting on the rim, gaze unfocused. He wasn't tinning the plants, not really. His thoughts drifted, looping back to the moment Sarah had stepped forward to speak for herself. The way her voice had filled the space, not loud, not angry, but undeniable. He had seen the change in her coming, but not like that, not with that fire. It stayed with him now, even as the dome's artificial cycle slid into night. She hadn't just stood up to them, she'd chosen him, and more importantly chosen herself, and that choice had changed everything. Sarah was sitting on the woven mat near the living console, her knees drawn to her chest, arms wrapped around them. Her eyes weren't distant this time, they were focused, awake. Every breath she took seemed purposeful, like her body was adjusting to the weight of finally having control over itself. Victor approached slowly, pausing a few paces away. You hungry? He asked gently. She looked up. A little. I made that broth you said you liked, the one with the sour root. Her mouth curved into the hint of a smile. You remembered? Of course I did. He stepped into the small galley and returned a few minutes later with 2 bowls. He handed hers over.